So, welcome to today's meetup. Our speaker today is Natalija Hellesoe. Did I say that right, Natalija?
More or less, that's fine.
Yes, sorry, I did practice, I promise. So Natalija is an organizational development coach, and she also specializes in OKRs, objective key results, for those who don't know what that stands for. And Natalija also recently released a book, which is titled, sorry guys, I'm not a multitasker, so trying to let people in as well as speaking. So the title of the book is OKRs at the Center, How to Drive Change with Goals and Create the Organization You Want. I had the pleasure to read that book recently, and the book is full of practical examples and case studies. And we are very, very looking forward to learn from you, Natalija.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation, Joanna. So maybe if we want to just get started with the audience of today, and if you want to share the poll results to just see who's in here for the talk, for the upcoming discussion. Okay. And we want to have here.
So can you see my screen? Actually, I can share this way. Sorry. Let me do that way. Okay. It's better.
So as always, we have a pretty good mix, I guess, of people who are rather new to the subject of OKRs. So just a little experience. Some of you are already pros, I saw on the screen here. Some even have extensive knowledge. That's great. So no one totally new. Then I'll just skip through the basics really quickly. And let's see what the perspective is. If you could scroll down in the poll there as well, Jenna, or me too. So that we have, half of you are Agile coaches or Scrum Masters. That's interesting to know. Some of you look at it from the management perspective and some from other looks. All right, thanks a lot for that introduction. And then I will see what to focus on today to get the most for you out of that time. So I shared a link to the mural board, and maybe just a quick explanation of what you can do there also while I'm talking and also during the discussions. So the idea is that we have a section on top where you can just copy paste your LinkedIn profile if you want to get into contact with other fellow OKR practitioners or people interested in the subject. I will cover some of the main ideas from the talk in the board later as well. And I also shared some upcoming events and some other resources that might be interesting for you. And I guess the most important feature here is frame number 5, so at the bottom, where feel free to just collect also Q&As while I'm talking. And then we'll definitely have enough time at the end to get through your most burning questions when it comes to OKRs, OKR implementation, or everything else that I'm going to share today. So this is more for the background today in Mural. So what we're going to do here is just give a little input and then dive into Q&A in the second part. So that's the idea for today, I would say. I see a lot of you running around on the mural board, so it looks like you're already active and yeah, ready to start. So I would say let's give it a go. So our topic of today is implementing OKRs is not the goal. And that might be a little counter-intuitive. And Joanna, if you could just help me out, because I'm not able to sharing right now. That would just be something.
Yeah, give me 1 second. I will make you host.
Course. So I can already get started while we'll figure that out. So implementing OKRs is not the goal, might be a little counterintuitive. And at the same time, I think it's an important topic to discuss right now, since OKR has become such a trending topic, not just in the Agile world, but across different organizational aspects and in the whole sector of transformation. And so when I work with many clients in the field of organizational development, they often come to me asking the question, so how can we now best implement OKRs for us? We heard about it, we read about it, we have seen all the success stories, and now we want to do it to improve also our way of working. So what's the best way now to do it? And so what they're trying to do is to take the simple idea of OKRs. So as some of you might know, the idea is to just use objectives and key results to bridge the gap between the long-term vision, the goals, the strategy, and what you do on a day-to-day basis, so the daily execution, by setting intentional, inspiring steps, so describing the next inspiring steps in an objective, and combining that with measurable key results.
Natalija, you should be able to share now.
Yeah, perfect. I can just jump right in there.
Thank you.
So, to combine the objective with the measurable key results that look at the objective from different perspectives and measure a change in a relative or absolute value. And since OKRs are not just something that kind of changes the way that you define goals, but it changes the way that you work with goals, you also look at an iterative cycle to work with OKRs. So you start with the definition, you set the goals for your team or for your organization, you regularly check progress and track progress in the check-in meetings, and then you reflect back at the end, learn and adjust. And then, of course, that's totally similar to some of the principles you might find in many other agile ways of working, so it'd be Scrum or anything else. And what customers or clients that I work with normally want is to take this idea and apply it not just to a team, but to a certain department or even the entire organization. And when they ask me the question, so how can we now best implement OKRs? 5 years ago, I would have just said, okay, let's dive in there. Let's look at your organization and find out what the best approach is. Because I always believe that there is no just single unique approach to do that, but it's of course dependent on the context that you work in the organization. That was how I would have treated that 5 years ago. Today, I totally believe that this is the wrong question to ask. Because, in my opinion, implementing OKRs can and should never be the goal. OKRs, as so many other frameworks and concepts out there, are just a means to an end. And so the important question to ask and to dig into should always be, so to what ultimate end for our organization for this moment in time? And so what I would like to invite you while I'm giving some input is to really reflect a little on yourself. You signed up for this meetup, so you're obviously somehow interested in OKR, but to kind of dive into, so what is OKR for you? Is it just kind of a trend topic? Is it something where you hop on the bandwagon because all the other companies are doing that? Or is it maybe something that actually gets down to the root causes of why your organization maybe doesn't succeed in the way it should be, or does it really solve some of your problems? And so I will walk you through a couple examples here and share a lot of questions that I also ask when I work with my clients. And my invitation for you would be to just maybe grab a pen and paper and go along the questions and just think for yourself and for your organization of what possible answers might be. And then I'm happy to share some conclusions and get into the discussion afterwards. So what we're going to do is to look into how can you actually intentionally use OKRs to solve your business problems, not just to implement OKRs. And so for that, we will not start with the question of what is the starting point in your organization and what are your next steps and how can you implement it, but we will actually dig deeper into, okay, what is it that you want to achieve with OKRs? So that could be the typical why question, but to not stop there, but to actually go all the way back into, so which problem do you actually want to solve with that? And to do that, Joanna already mentioned that I work with different companies, but maybe just to give you a certain background on how I look at the topic, I actually have a background in HR and transformation. And I guess that's why I look at topics like objectives and key results, not just as kind of a concept in the toolbox, but a lot on, what does that actually mean for the organization? Why do we want to get into that? What are the consequences when we think about implementing these ways of working? And so that's also something that I would like to share with you today. So I think the last 12 months have been the best example ever of this whole unknown space, the complexity, the uncertainty, everything that we already know existed, but it just kind of came crashing down so obviously right in our face that we couldn't deny it anymore in our organizations. And of course, many organizations then ask a question, so what do we then now need to thrive in this complex, uncertain, fast-paced environment? And I guess the answers that many organizations find, and that probably the bigger part of you who work in the agile space always finds, is something that could maybe be, yes, summarized in certain principles like these. So it's always about how can we create a strong focus? How can we foster better alignment? How can we actually drive value creation in our organizations? How can we increase meaningful contribution of every single employee in the organization and enable decision-making autonomously where it makes most sense for what we're trying to accomplish? And of course, to embed fast learning cycles in everything we do to actually have the necessary flexibility to meet these demands of the unknown. We all know that. The interesting part, though, is that as soon as something like a possible solution offers itself, we often in organizations fall into something that I like to call the simple cure paradox. So we have all the knowledge about complexity. We know that there is no easy solution. We know that we need a lot of experimentation. But still, then we read about OKRs and think, ooh, this could be something that actually helps. And even better, OKRs themselves are inspired by the agile principles. So it takes into account fast learning cycles, fast decision-making, autonomy. Isn't that great? That must be the thing that actually really helps us. Maybe you recognize some of the behavior in your organization. So what we actually do is we already climb up the tree and we find ourselves at the place of the solution. And it's really comfy there. We have a great overview and it's just the question, so what is next? But the invitation, I always try to speak out then to my clients when we talk about a possible OKR implementation is to actually pack up your gear and climb all the way down with me back into the problem space first and really dive deep into, okay, does this actually make sense? Or are we kind of falling into the trap of this new shiny object syndrome that OKRs sometimes stand for? And so the first important question will be, of course, which problem is it that you want to solve? So how can you maybe go about that? There are, of course, many variations to do that. I mean, design sprints and all these kind of things have many methods in there as well. What I like to do when I'm talking about OKRs is to start with what are currently the biggest problems and challenges in your organizations? What are you facing here? And if you now think about your own organizations, could you name the biggest problems and challenges, not just in your department, but on a grander scale? So what is it your organization is really struggling with? If you want, just write that down to take your thoughts a little further. And maybe you find yourself in a similar position like one of my clients last year. So they wanted to implement OKRs. And of course, they came up with the question, how can we now go about that? And since I, as a dependable coach, wanted to dig deeper because I know that just implementing OKRs will not bring the solution that they expect, I started to ask questions like, why did you get into the OKR space? Why did you even look for a solution? What is the background of that? And then you might also hear in your organization things like, well, we're not aligned across the functions. We need more focus. We need to improve the strategy execution and things like that. So kind of a very meta level problem description of what is actually going on. And I think one of the most interesting questions you can ask whenever you are presented with a challenge of your client, of your organization, or even yourself is, why is this actually a problem? And I found that so interesting because you could say, we're not aligned across functions. So what? We could just keep it that way and maybe not everything runs smoothly, but why is it an actual problem? Why is it something where we need to put effort and resources and energy into actually solving that? And then you might get a little closer towards the actual problem that you're looking at. So maybe you find something like, well, we would actually need aligned goals to focus on our resources because we don't have enough employees at the moment. Or we're not actually getting things done because we do too many things at once. And so products are shipped too late and things like that. Hopefully you get a little closer to the problem, but you're probably not there yet. So through a series of questions or other methods alike, what I'm trying to get out of a customer is an actual problem statement. And one way that I found helpful to kind of, trigger that discussion is something that is inspired a little by organizational behavior science. So I try to kind of dial it down into a problem statement of this sort. So first of all, I try to distinguish, is the problem something that you want to change? So is it more like an opportunity that you see? Or is it something that you actually need to change in order to be successful or to even survive as a company? And then to find some kind of verbal expression, okay, if that is something that we need to change, then what is kind of the aspect we want to do here? Is it something we want to improve, we want to grow, we want to increase? What does it actually mean? And just a side note here, this is also, I find, a great practice for writing OKRs, to actually try to formulate things in a whole sentence where you need to really name the person and find a verbal expression of the activity you're doing and so on. And so once you know that, the question is, okay, what aspect of the organization are we looking at? Is it a question of effectiveness? Is it a question of efficiency? Is it a question of quality? Like, what is it actually that we're trying to change here? And lastly, the most important aspect, probably, based on what? Why are we actually having this problem? What brought this problem to our attention? Was it a market demand? Was it something that our employees brought up to our attention? Is it just resulting from some business trends on the outside, or part of an organizational change problem that we started off? And that leads us to another important question. And when you look at the problems you identify in your company, the question could be, so for whom is it an actual problem? Who is kind of the addressant of that problem? And that can lead you to something else, and that is the distinction between internal and external references. What do I mean with that? I mean, many problems that we often come up with are linked to something that only happens internally in the organization. So it might be linked to the structures we want to improve, or the way that people lead or take responsibility in our organization, or the way that we pay our salaries, or something like that. But the question is, if we want to change these things in the organization, here again, to what ultimate end? Why would we even want to put a certain level of energy and resources into changing our structures? What would it actually improve outside the organization? So for our customers, for our clients in the market, for our competitive situation. So what would the external reference be? And why is that then important? And there are, of course, whole books written on, okay, should you always have an external reference? And is it only an actual problem if it connects to an external reference? I guess there are different opinions here, but I think what is important here is that you come to your own conclusion where you can say, do I have the reference that I'm looking for? And if you're striving towards actually getting external references, then your problem should have a connection to an actual reference, an actual external reference. And let's say, just for the sake of that call and this talk, that you now have a pretty good idea of your problem, your opportunity. Then, of course, now is the time to look into possible solutions. So what can we actually do in order to solve that problem, or to create that opportunity? Or what kind of preconditions do we maybe need to establish in the company to be able to actually address that problem? And then, of course, we come back to what we already know about the complexity and experimentation, and think in many different directions. So if we're talking, for example, about organizational effectiveness, we could think about structural changes, changes, of course, in the way we set our goals, or in our task management, or in the way that we address competitors, or whatever it might be. And this might be the first point where actually our OKR journey comes to a dead end before it even starts. Because we might look into then what is the desired future state if we actually gonna solve that problem? What does that actually look like? What is then different, to get a little closer to actually knowing what does that mean in our context? And so this could lead to this first dead end of OKRs, when we might realize that in our context, what might actually solve the biggest problem at hand is not a change in the way that we work with goal, but is something completely different. Of course, it could also be the opposite. And we come to the conclusion saying that, well, OKRs might actually help us to solve that biggest problem. And then the journey can continue. And when you now look at the desired state that you came up before, that might already give you some clues of where OKRs might actually be of help to solve your problem. So the question can then be, okay, what do I want to achieve with OKRs, but always in order to help solve that problem that I identified or to reach the desired future state that I identified. Not to go into an argumentation of saying, okay, why is OKR the greatest concepts ever? Because I will always find arguments for that, but to really connect it to the problem that you kind of defined beforehand. And so what companies then often come up with is, okay, what do we want to achieve with OKRs? We're kind of back to the start. It's a lot about focus and alignment and autonomy. But I think also here the important question is, what does that mean in your context? And to really dig deep into what does that mean for us? What does focus mean for us? What is this thing that we then call focus or alignment? And what is then different when we actually have that in place in our organization? And so, for example, that could also mean that we come to another dead end thinking that when we have the clarity of what it means in our context, it also might lead to the conclusion that OKR is maybe not the best concept to solve that. On the other hand, in the case of my customer, for example, this is what they came up with for the desired state for part of the problem. Now, that they wanted to work together, meaning they wanted to really work aligned on a shared vision that wasn't in place, with clear priorities to make the best use of their resources and on the right things in their context supporting the strategy. So these were the kind of the three priorities that I find in terms of these being the preconditions to actually be successful and solve some of the problems that they had at hand. And so that led them to the conclusion that OKR might actually be of help in terms of aligning them, but of course not alone, but together with a vision that they need to create first. They could be of help to set clear priorities and to work on the right things if the strategy is really incorporated in working with OKRs in the process. And so when you dial down from the problem you want to solve to what you want to achieve with OKRs, then of course the next question might be, so what is now my starting point and how can I go about it in my company? Because we said in the headline that we want to intentionally use it and not just intentionally towards the problem, but of course also intentionally to your starting point. And the starting point can mean a lot of different things. First of all, it can mean to find your personal way. And that is something I cannot strive enough when it comes to OKR, because there's a lot of great material out there, but what is not out there is the one right way, the one correct way, the one only way to do OKRs. And the one description to saying we need 4 key results, we need to do it every 3 months, and we need to do it this and that. But what is out there is a lot of different variations on how to best apply the underlying principles in different contexts. So what you need to do is to look at your context first. Where does your organization stand now? How do you live leadership? What structures do you have in place? How does compensation and all that for you work? Because when you want to introduce something like OKRs, they are not introduced in a vacuum, but they actually need to be integrated to what you currently have in your organization. So to have clarity around your context is the one part. And the other part is what it might then lead to in terms of OKRs. So what I often see in practice is companies starting to use OKR, and they're really focused on creating transparency, improving their performance, maybe gaining a little goal flexibility and a little learning pace, but really narrow it down to focus, transparency, and performance. And the outcome of that often is that they write OKRs looking something like this. So very what you could call output-focused OKRs, looking at results, giving very clear instruction. And normally that also happens in a very top-down approach, creating a very clear OKR tree of what people need to do. Of course, here you could ask the question, are we doing OKRs right? Is that even doing OKRs, or is that something else or something in between? And here again, I don't think, are we doing OKRs right, is a really helpful question. But the more helpful question will be, are we solving our problems with the way we're doing OKR? Are we creating opportunities that we're looking for when we create OKRs? And so, for example, for these types of company, creating a shared focus and actually having transparency over the goals might be a necessary first precondition and a huge win already. It might not be what we call the best OKRs ever, but if it helps them to set the necessary preconditions for the next step, I wouldn't say it's a wrong thing to do. But of course, there are other things people are looking for. Outcome to be one. Yeah, many companies are starting to use OKR to get more into an outcome space. Unfortunately, OKRs do not come with built-in outcomes. I know that's a bummer. That's one of the expectations many people have when they start using OKRs. But also here, you as an organization, you need to make a conscious decision. We want to focus on outcomes, and we also want to integrate it in our OKR process. So when we're looking for more an outcome space, so it's about value-driven goals, value-driven structures and processes, and probably also focusing on motivation, then your OKRs might look something like this. So more focusing on the effect you're trying to achieve, on measuring changes in, for example, customer user behavior, and probably also defining them more in a top-down, bottom-up aligned approach. And then we also find companies who do it totally differently. And that's what we call also in the book, the autonomy stage. So companies who already might have focus, who might have transparent goals, for them, outcome orientation is just ingrained in all their processes. And they find maybe we even need a totally different structure and a different way of working to even now better identify and solve the needs of our customers. And so they might come up with something that looks like this. So a totally autonomous OKR structure that is not linked to the classic OKR tree, but where they actually say we have autonomous teams that create their own purpose, mission, or vision, and then create their own OKR sets derived from that. And here again, this is not a wrong or right question. It's just, where does your company currently stand? What makes sense as a next step? And what are you trying to then achieve? And how can then the concept of OKR be helpful in that regard? But if you want to sum it up, you could put it in a picture like that. So what we often see is that companies roughly go through these stages one way or the other. That's of course not linear, because we're still living in a complex world, so there are no easy linear graphs as well. But maybe that can give some orientation to where your company currently stands and what might be a good way to look for an OKR setup, but also to look for, okay, what are we actually trying to do here? And the interesting thing, and I actually looked at the graph again after going into the problem space a lot with my clients, and that was that I realized that when you go through this phase, it might also just be a problem development from an internal to an external view. Because once you start off with just focusing on transparency, on performance, that is something that is normally really internally focused for the company. So you're kind of still looking a lot for internal problem references. And the more you move to the right side, the more you actually focus on external problems references and try to solve problems for your users and your customers, and then adjust the way that you structure your company or the way that you do goals according to these external problem developments. And so the book that Joanna mentioned beforehand, if you want to get deeper into these case studies, feel free to have a look there. There it's explained in a little greater detail. But I want to share something else with you today, because once you have a clarity around the problem and what you want to achieve with OKRs and your starting point, then you have, of course, a good foundation to think about, so what is now the next possible step, and to design your individual OKR approach. Of course, disclaimer, without sacrificing the underlying principles. I am a total believer that it's not the idea of OKR to then say, oh, it fits best that we do it just every 12 or 24 months and that we don't use iterations or anything like that. But to really think about, okay, what from this beautiful palette of options in terms of how often we do OKRs, what we write into the OKRs, or who participates in the set definition, what kind of maturity on the development scale are we looking at, and how do we want to go about the OKR cycle to really make use of these variation based on your starting point and especially the problem that you're trying to solve. And then go back again into experimentation mode with these different approaches. So with different cadences, with different variations of OKR sets and the like. And the important part here I find is no matter which decision you are consciously making for your company, it will always be a trade-off. I don't believe that there is then the right solution for your company, but there are different trade-offs that you can make. For example, going back to this very famous picture, but the point here is OKR are often described as this great solution of how can we then combine alignment and autonomy. So what is then kind of the best solution to fit both? And I believe that there is always a trade-off that you still need to make in order for how much do you then go into the alignment or the autonomy or the learning cycles or setting up your structure for complexity or all the other factors, or even a trade-off not just between the alignment and the autonomy, but also the internal and the external references. So there are a lot of conscious decisions for trade-offs that you need to make when you work with OKRs. So I think instead of just focusing your efforts on finding the right solution, the discussions about what trade-off makes sense for our company based on the problem that we're trying to solve is the better way to go. And so making that conscious choice based on your problem to solve and not the solution at hand is what I cannot just only recommend for OKRs, but I guess for every concept that you're going into. And so that's also something that I'm trying to do in the trainings that I offer, really getting into that, okay, does OKRs make sense for us and in our context, and how can we make this decision up front, whether we want to pursue that, we want to take the effort and the energy into that. And so if you want to join us, we also have a monthly meetup talking about all these difficult and at the same time really interesting aspects of OKRs. But coming back to the essence of today, it really is that implementing OKRs is not the goal. It might be that shiny, nice object that you stumbled across in a talk, in a conference, in a book, or heard from colleagues, but it is always just a means to an end. And so the question is, to what ultimate end for your company, and what is it for you? Do you want to hop on the bandwagon and kind of just meet the trend wave and implement OKRs? Or do you want to climb down the tree with me and get into the root causes and your problems to actually find something that OKRs can help you with? Let's take it that far. And then I'm really interested to hear your comments, your questions, and anything else that you want to share.
Thanks very much, Natalija. That was really inspiring. And it's really interesting to hear because now OKR became so trendy. It's really nice. You're driving this conversation. Is it really the tool for us? And do we really need it? So personally, I very much enjoyed the talk. Thanks very much. We have a few questions, yes. And actually, before I will start reading the questions, anybody who would like to ask the questions, we have around 20 minutes for them. Please type them in the chat and I will go through them. And also just for your information, the talk is recorded and will be posted on the meetup in the comments after this meetup. And link to Mural will also be shared in the comments. You can exchange the LinkedIn profiles there for all those who are interested in OKR topics. And also somebody asked me, the last question, Natalija, was, oh yeah, somebody already replied, the link to your meetup, and somebody already provided it, so perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, so the first question. OKRs can be defined at different levels, strategic, tactical, and operational. Is it a good practice to define 2 to 5 objectives per level?
Yeah, good question. Thank you for that. Going back to what I just tried to offer here is yes and no. I would say, yes, it's a good practice and it works for many companies to define 2 to 5 objectives per level. But then again, I would like to kind of turn the question back. So what is it you're trying to accomplish here with the OKRs? And if, for example, one of your most important topics is focus, I would highly recommend to at least try to dial it down into at least 2 or 3 objective max. So to really have these hard discussions in terms of, okay, what is it that we want to focus on right now? Because I find in the OKR definition, it is important to have a commitment on what we want to focus on in our objectives, but it is just as important to have a commitment. What do we not focus on for the next OKR cycle? What are we actually sure and what do we commit to in this team on this level that was not part of our focus for the cycle? And so the more objectives you allow, of course, the more room you might have. At the same time, to give out a rule like we need 2 to 5 objective and it cannot be 6 or 1. In my personal experience, that doesn't really help, but it's more about, okay, what are we trying to accomplish, and to give that out as a principle. We want to focus it down as much as possible because we want to focus our resources on the most important projects. And then a rule of thumb could be 2 to 5. So kind of set that into context a little more instead of just writing down good practices would how I would go about it.
Okay, thanks very much, Natalija. The next question is, can we use other management tools like EBM, evidence-based management, together with OKRs? Are they complementary?
Let me answer the question like that. I haven't gotten that deep into EBM, to be honest, but maybe on a broader scale is, of course, you can use many different management tools together with OKR. I think 2 questions I would ask myself is, okay, are they kind of trying to solve the same problems? Are we moving in the same direction as them, or might they be of conflicting nature, and therefore we might need to look into, okay, is it really useful to keep both of them, or can we maybe also get rid of one or the other, use them in different contexts? Whether or not EBM and OKRs are totally complementary is something I would love to look into further, but I don't have a sufficient answer for you yet, so I don't even want to try. But if there's anyone who is a professional in EBM who has an example, then feel free to share here as well.
Okay. Thanks very much, Natalija, and thanks for being honest. Very much appreciated. Another question, asking open right questions. Is that the main approach to better define OKRs? Start with a problem, use root cause analysis, 5 whys, and some lean tools.
I would say when I define OKRs with teams or with whole organizations, I use a lot of open questions, yes, because I find OKRs are then most beneficial if you actually take the time and give the space for people to think what might be the most important problems to solve, what might be the most important topics. And I think only with open questions, you actually open up the space enough for people to get away from what is maybe already set, what are the products that we're already building, what is already maybe lined out in the roadmap. So to really create a different thinking space, that's what I always call it, to have a foundation for OKRs. And so it's kind of similar of what I showed you today on kind of going into the discussion of whether or not to use OKR is a similar approach than what I use in the workshops, and especially 5 whys is something that I use a lot to identify also overlying objectives, maybe on different flight levels, and also get people to think about the connection and to the bigger strategic topics. So short answer would be yes, that would be my approach.
Okay, thank you. And Natalija, I think the next question is a little bit linked with our previous question, but I think sometimes, we need to repeat the message number of times before it, settles well. So can you again reply? So outcomes, outputs, activity, capability at any level.
So what is the question? Sorry,
so outcomes, so that's how it goes. Outcomes, outputs, activity, capability at any level. So should be doing that at any level, basically, the question.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying. I would say there I have a similar opinion of what you might find in, for example, just Seiden's book on outcomes over output, that when we talk about a high level of OKRs, we're often talking about more the impact or the outcome level. And the further down in the organization you go, the harder it might be to define outcome or impact related OKRs. And I would say that's totally fine. I think the important point for me would be to actually have a discussion with the teams on all level of what the differentiation between output and outcome actually is, what that looks like in the company, and to at least try and get as close to an outcome definition in the OKRs as possible in your team. As I said, it might be a little harder in the lower levels of OKR, but to have that general distinction, I would say, yes, that's valuable for all the levels. And that's something that I would include in kind of the basic OKR foundational trainings or workshops or whatever you have, just to get people thinking in that direction, because I think that's the more important step than just clearly defining, okay, you need to have outcome OKRs also on your team level. Sometimes it might not be feasible, but the knowledge about what the difference is, I think that's important for all the levels, yes.
Okay, thank you. And next question is, it's a statement, but it has a question mark at the end. So I guess we are looking here for validation. So alignment and autonomy. In huge organization with multiple departments and areas, start in one area, for example, marketing, obtain the quick wins results in certain period, for example, 6 months, and then spread into other areas of work, question mark. So can you validate or can you correct that statement? Thanks.
So thanks for that statement, Carlos. So if I understand it correctly, but please say if I don't. The question would be, is it a good way to then start in a certain area with OKRs, for example, and then obtain the quick results there, and then spread the concept in other areas of work? And I would say, yes, that's definitely something to look into in companies. But here again, when you start to experiment with OKRs, I would ask myself different questions. One would be, okay, where do I actually find an environment in my company that is open towards OKRs? The other thing is, what kind of hypotheses do I want to test in the experimentation phase? Is it just whether it works in my companies? Is it to just experiment with it in teams that have an actual need right now for OKRs? Or is it, for example, if OKRs can work outside of the product department or anything like that? So just to be clear, before you think about an implementation or a pilot approach, what is it that I'm trying to find out here? And the other important aspect I want to mention is, I don't think that when you start using OKR in marketing, yes, it might give you a good idea of what it might be like in your context, but I don't think it will give you a good idea of what it might be like in the IT department or in sales or in finance, because they might just be very, very different in your organization. So just spreading it into other areas, like in a classical implementation approach, might not work, but you might need to look into different forms. The other thing, and I'm not sure if you're getting at that with a question, but just maybe to add on that, alignment and autonomy, when we think about classic multiple departments and areas, might actually be something where OKRs have a severe downside. And that is when you use OKRs for functional areas or for the silos that you have established in your companies, it might actually lead to bigger conflicts than you already have, because you then ingrain kind of the functional silos into the OKRs by trying to define OKRs for marketing and for sales or for IT. So you kind of re-establish the silos, the dependencies, and kind of the problems that you already might have there. So it might be a good idea then after an experimentation phase to think about, could we maybe work with virtual OKR teams? Could we work with shared OKRs? Could we work with something that goes more into the direction of what we're trying to accomplish here with aligned autonomy, meaning bringing people together that actually solve problems in the best way, that might be not directly linked to the organizational structure we have, but then OKRs can maybe be a means to an end to get a little closer to a structure that might actually be beneficial for the value creation. But Carlos, let me know if I tapped on some of the aspects you wanted to get in there, if there's anything missing.
Carlos, you can unmute yourself. We are self-organized, so you can unmute yourself if you would like to contribute.
No, the point is, I have already read the book. I have already exchanged some messages with Natalija, and I'm just trying to clarify. Yeah, thank you very much for your explanation.
Okay, thanks a lot, Carlos.
Thank you. And Natalija, thanks very much for also bringing our awareness to the common pitfalls, because that is also a great lesson learned we can get from others. What are the potential risks of doing it one way, not the other. Okay, the next question is, I agree that OKRs is not the goal. What other frameworks are available for goal settings as effective as OKRs? Would you be able to advise on this one, Natalija?
That's an interesting question, especially with the last part of the question. So as effective as OKR, I would say I don't have an answer to that question, because what is as effective as OKR in your context? Like, I could never tell you what that might be. If you're looking at other frameworks in terms of, okay, similar principles or having similar solutions for goal setting. I mean, some companies, for example, look into Hoshin Kanri and frameworks alike. But also here, I would look into, okay, is it goal setting that you're trying to solve here? So is that really your need? And then what about the goal setting is it that you're trying to change? So is it that you're looking into something that serves for shorter iterations? Is it something that creates transparency? So what are kind of the requirements for goal setting frameworks in your context based on your problems that might then be a good fit, or possibly something that you can experiment with? Because OKRs might be super effective in one company, or another framework might be super effective, but might not have anything to do positively for your problems in your organization. So as effectively as, yeah, there's probably tons out there, but depending on what you're trying to change in your organization.
Okay, thank you very much. So just for Carlos, there are some people reply to your questions, so there are some answers there if you want to read through the chat. And some people put some tools like some PDF or some document on evidence-based management, and some comments. So please feel free to read through the chat. And so, Natalija, and any more questions? Because we have a few more minutes. If anybody has any more questions, feel free to unmute yourself. We are self-organized, so everybody can unmute yourself. Okay, no? Okay.
Hi, sorry, I've got a question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about OKRs and strategic change. So obviously OKRs can help with alignment, but do you think that the framework can support where a strategic change happens quite suddenly in a company, and then we need the people within that company to be able to pivot and to deal with that sort of thing?
So if I understand the question right, is the background is that you have actually a strategic change, a kind of a shift in the way that you go about, how you actually work, what you're trying to accomplish, and what the best way is to accomplish that on a strategic level, and whether or not OKRs can support that. So I would say, since OKRs are mainly based on the long-term goals and the strategy, if a shift there happens, I would see some potential in OKRs helping with that, because they kind of bring the attention to the strategic change and then try, based on the new strategic direction, to find out what is then now the most important next step that we need to undertake. So I think it can be something that helps to clarify the strategic change, to build the next steps based on the new strategy, and just also kind of enhance the whole communication and commitment around that. On the other hand, I don't believe that it's sufficient to just then do OKRs for the strategic change, but of course we would need some other endeavors in terms of change facilitation. But yes, I would see a lot of potential to help on that journey.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Natalija.
Natalija, we have another question here. What is the best way to identify the stages, performance, outcomes, autonomy, and apply regular assessments?
Good question. I love that. Well, for me, the best is to actually share it. So how I do it with my clients, maybe that is helpful, is I talk to them about the stages, about the things that I see in companies happen on a daily basis, and that we came up with this model to kind of, just in a simplified version, put it into the 3 stages and what we see happening there and what we see in terms of OKR assessment and how they write OKRs. And then I let them do a self-assessment, yes. So I would never go about to say, okay, this is what I see in your company happening. So you might be somewhere here on the scale, but I think the important point is that they reflect on, okay, what do we see happening? What kind of discussions are we having? What are the aspects that are mentioned when top management, for example, talks about OKRs? What is it actually about? And then maybe take that as a stepping stone towards, okay, when we see ourselves maybe between the performance and the outcome stage, is this actually where we want to be, or do we want to be something else? And what could then be the next important step? So kind of getting into an OKR type of mindset, what is the next important step that we would need to undertake to move further if that's what we're looking for? And so, of course, a kind of self-assessment might be helpful just to see what is going on. Have we made any improvement? But that being said, at the same time, the goal is not to just be as far to the right on that little graph that we made as possible, because having this autonomy kind of stage is not better or worse than the performance stage. It's just a different goal and a different setup. So I think when you know where you want to be with your company, then you can, of course, do regular self-assessments to find out where are we right now and what might be a next possible step. Yes.
Thank you, Natalija. Natalija, I will download the chat and I will let you to share the chat later. Lots of compliments going your direction. If anybody would like to send more kudos to Natalija or give a feedback, please share that. Feedback is very valuable. It's valuable for us as an I team to know what works, what doesn't work, but also it's very good for Natalija. How do you find that approach I want to say challenging. Challenging, I think it's a right word. Sometimes people don't like that word, but it's a constructively challenging the usage of OKRs and questioning yourself first. Is it something what you need rather than blindly following the prescriptive approach? So we have, I think we can conclude here. So Natalija, so the last question I have, so what's the right approach?
There is no right approach, but I'm happy to find that out with my clients. And thanks everyone for being here today and kind of bringing all your thoughts into the discussion, because I think that's what the right approach is about, to just keep experimenting, keep looking, keep questioning, and then seeing what the potential in OKRs can be that you bring to your company, but also to make a conscious decision if that might not be the right thing to do at that moment in time, maybe later, maybe never. But I think it will definitely keep things interesting to look into these concepts.
Thank you very much, Natalija. That was a pleasure. And I hope everybody enjoyed it as much as I did. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Joanna. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day, evening, night, wherever you are. And let's continue the discussion.